Um, Look, I was in uh, Russia actually in 1986 when they were still, and Gorbachev had just come in '85, and so he pursued the war fairly heavily for his first year. I don't know whether he really believed in it at all or whether he was just allowing the generals to uh, to do what they said they could do and show them up. But in any case, he pursued the war fairly heavily in 1986, and while I was in '85 and '86, so they showed me um, slick magazines they were producing about their operations in Afghanistan, and these were in English. In other words, they weren't for Afghans, they weren't for Russians, they were for the world audience to show them that they were being good guys. It was exactly the kind of stuff that colleagues of mine were turning out in Vietnam. This was '86, so 20 years earlier. Building schools, building clinics. And the truth was that one reason, by the way, people were fighting them was that they were combating the drug trade, which they relied on, the opium trade, and they were educating women. Well, that's enough to get good jihadists from all over the world to oppose that, after all. So, meanwhile, and that was, in a way, the ideological basis for the resistance to the Russians. But the Russians, of course, couldn't see it that way with some reason. And the very same reasons that impelled us. Look what we're doing. We're bringing you into the modern world, or these people into the modern world. We're educating your women, we're building schools and clinics and all this. And so it was the same total bullshit. They could not see themselves as people who would be opposed by these backward religious fanatics and these feudal warlords. So at one point, I remember I was talking, I think, I can't remember now if this is my first trip or my second. I think this might have been later, like '87, another trip. And I'm talking to a guy named Evgeny Velikov, who was the top science advisor to Gorbachev. And of course, I dealt almost entirely with nuclear stuff. That's why I was talking to him. And he was very important in that subject. But the subject of Afghanistan came up. And so I remember now how it came. I had talked to him before, the year before, how hopeless Afghanistan was for the Soviets. Now remember, in this country, people like McCain think the only reason we lost in Vietnam was the media and Congress's reaction to the media, and college students didn't want to be drafted. So you had draft resistance, you had a youth movement, you had the media showing things on TV. But here you had the Soviets, who were not constrained by an anti-war movement. They didn't have a youth movement opposing them. They didn't have an anti-draft movement. They didn't have demonstrations. And they were prepared to be as ruthless as they felt they needed to be, using helicopters, rockets, every kind of thing. And they weren't winning, as I said, as I predicted from the very beginning. By the way, a lot of people were predicting, who hated the Soviets, they're gonna show us how it's done. They're gonna show what we could have done in Vietnam. Right. So I said right from the beginning, I won't go through the whole thing. There are various differences obviously in Vietnam and Afghanistan in various ways, but there were enough similarities that I was sure that the Soviets would not do any better than we had done in Vietnam. And that turned out to be true, of course. So anyway, on my second trip, Velikov is saying to me, you're going to be very happy about this. He said, we've made the decision to close it out in Afghanistan. We're going to get out of Afghanistan. And that, I can tell you that privately, secretly, that decision has been made. And he said, all we're going to ask is that there be a government left in Kabul that will be friendly to the Soviets. That's all. I said, you're not getting out of Vietnam. of Afghanistan. Same idea. You have not, in my opinion, made the decision to get out of Afghanistan, and you are not in the process of getting out of Afghanistan. You're in the process of staying in Afghanistan. Because so long as you keep the provision on that you have to decide what kind of government there is in Afghanistan, in Kabul, and that it's got to be one that serves your interests, or at least is friendly to you, or not unfriendly to you, you're going to be there forever. You are not going to leave a government that is friendly to you if you leave. Not until you decide you're going to get out. Whoever succeeds you, will you be on your way out? And actually, I got so passionate talking about this that I started to cry thinking about Vietnam. I was comparing it to Vietnam. And I don't remember exactly what it was that brought tears to my eyes, but something did. And I think that made a strong impression because I'd been talking this very pragmatic, tough, Rand type stuff about nuclear weapons and what they ought to do about that. Very business-like. And I think the fact that I felt so strongly about that I started to cry about the fact that they were staying in Afghanistan the way we stayed in Vietnam, that they were very sobered. And Velikov's aide after that came to me and said, you've made a very strong case here, a very strong impression. And now, I presume I didn't have any effect on events. Probably. On the other hand, it's also true that Velikov was a major advisor, a very significant advisor to Gorbachev. But anyway, the later word was, he got to me, was, we're getting out. We're getting out. And I think I didn't hear that directly from him. It was in the news. The decision has been made. They're going to get out, whoever they leave behind. And interestingly, the guy they left behind, who they expected without Soviet support, major support, would be overthrown very quickly, actually wasn't. Because in Kabul, in the cities, the people there were so against the warlords that we were supplying against the Soviets that they weren't eager to see them in power. And the guy stayed in power for a couple of years with us supporting the Mujahideen, the people we're fighting now, the jihadists, against them, and the warlords that we're also supporting, until the Soviets withdrew all support, material and financial, so forth. Then he went down, and they hanged him from a lamppost. And he was much better than anybody who's come since. But we were determined to get any vestige of Soviet vestige out of Afghanistan so that we could go in eventually. Wonderful. So actually, in this symposium I just saw in DC on Vietnam, lessons of Vietnam 40 years later, 40 years after the ending of the war. The first paper was on, could we have won in Vietnam? And the question is exactly like, could the Soviets have won in Afghanistan? And it has the same answer, by the way. But it's the same question. Now, we always think of the Soviets, of course, as having committed aggression in Afghanistan, which they did. So asking whether they could have won is of some interest to look at academically, but again, it's very similar to addressing the question, could Hitler have won in Poland or in Yugoslavia, or for that matter, in Russia to take on a bigger war? It's some interest, but you really have to start with the idea he had no business whatever invading, or occupying. He was an aggressor, as the Soviets were in Afghanistan. And that was closely related not only to the question of whether they had a right to win, but whether they were likely to win. The people they were opposing felt that their cause was just, defending their own territory, and they were right. And they felt that much more deeply than the Soviets could feel about staying in Afghanistan, or we could feel about staying in Vietnam or Afghanistan. Would the American public be willing to see us out of Afghanistan? Sure. Obama would face the challenge from McCain and all of the Republicans. You lost Afghanistan. And could Americans live with having lost Afghanistan? Yeah, we live pretty well with having lost Vietnam. Have you noticed? The country has imploded for that reason. Not really. We get along without Vietnam. As a matter of fact, we're just starting to sell arms to Vietnam this year, this month, I think it is. They've become essentially capitalist. So, um, yes, could we live without? Could the public bear living having lost Afghanistan? Yes, but would some votes go to demagogues on either party who say, I would not have lost in Afghanistan. Our prestige has gone down. Nobody will believe us. Our credibility is down. We're weak, et cetera, et cetera. What Chris Christie is saying right now. See, could that get him some votes? Yeah, I know. People are easily manipulated on those scores. So they know what they're doing politically. Uh, do they actually face how many people are going to die as a result of their determination not to be called losers? No, they don't calculate that. They don't look at it. And really, they don't care. They don't care. Nixon never had to face the idea that he lost Vietnam. And he got us out. People are glad of that. But he didn't lose it. Saigon was still in Q's hands when Nixon left office. That was enough. So would he have done it? Would he have done that if he knew that 23,000 Americans would die and more than 1 million Vietnamese would die? Well, I can't judge, but Mort Halpern, who worked for Kissinger and worked for Nixon, said, oh, absolutely, they would have done it. That was okay. They achieved their goals, basically. They didn't lose.